facing the death penalty and other marginalized groups. And we're based in Jakarta, Indonesia. It is my honor to chair this session titled Drugs and Beyond, Upholding Human Rights. An issue that is very dear to my heart, and I believe it's also dear to your heart. 10 years ago, when I first started my work on drug policy in Indonesia, drug policy was hardly seen as a human rights issue. Vice versa, human rights activists and communities were so allergic to the word drugs and drug policy. I know that Indonesia is behind in almost everything, but this situation, the misconnection between human rights and drug policy, is also true in many other parts of the world. But today, it is virtually impossible to speak about drug policy without speaking about the rights of people who use drugs, the rights of people who are affected by this failing drug policy. As we all have heard from many amazing speakers in the past 1.5 days, drugs has become more and more visible as a human rights issue. We have been exposed to many flagrant human rights abuses conducted in the name of the drug war. In many parts of the world, thousands of people are put in jail for non-violent drug offenses. Hundreds of people were tortured, killed, and arrested for drug offenses. And countless are put in a forced treatment. In this session, we will hear from 4 speakers. All are leading experts and activists who have been pushing for justice and upholding human rights against the backdrop of the drug war. And I will introduce our first speaker, which is Mr. Rodrigo Uprimny. Mr. Uprimny is a Colombian lawyer, currently the Director of Drug Policy at the Center for the Study of Law, Justice and Society, also called Dejusticia. He is a professor at the National University of Colombia. He was a Deputy Justice for the Colombian Constitutional Court. He has written many articles on human rights, constitutional law, drug trafficking, and drug policy. Many of his articles I quoted on my thesis. He is also currently one of the members of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So without further ado, I invite Mr. Uprimny.
Thank you, Ayen. Good morning to everyone. First, I want to thank Harm Reduction International for this invitation. It's really an honor for me being here. And I want to make a very small caveat. I'm not speaking here officially on behalf of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, even if I think that most of the members of the committee share my position, but I'm speaking here on my personal capacity. What I'm going to give in this very short presentation is about the potential of human rights law to achieve more human and democratic drug policies. I think we have here a huge potential, but an unexploited potential, because as Ayen said, there has been a kind of separation between human rights law and drug policy. For that, I will develop some thesis, in order to make it more clear. So if you want to put that the title of a picture in the cinema, it would be 5 theses and a final message. The first thesis is very well known, and it's a political one, and it's about the very negative impact of drug policy in human rights. The thesis is very well known here, but it's not known outside conferences like this one, so it's worth reiterating it. And it's that drug policy, especially those policies based on a very punitive interpretation of drug convention, have been one of the most important drivers of massive human rights violation all over the world. Either because the drug policies in itself violates the rights, for instance by establishing death penalty for non-violent criminal offenses related to drugs, either because in the wake of drug policies, gross human rights violations are made, like the extrajudicial killings in Philippines, or either because the indirect effects of prohibition, for instance in Latin America, because of the creation of an illicit economy that fools mafias that have been threatening our democratic states over the 2 or 3 previous decades. So it's a very well-known thesis, but I think it's important to reiterate. The second one is related with what our chair, Ayen, have just said. I say that one of the reasons why drug policy has full human rights violation all over the world is because there has been a strong separation between human rights law and discussions on drug policy and discussion on drug prevention. Until very recently, if you were in a human rights venue or a human rights discussion, you wouldn't speak about drug policy. And on the other side, if you were speaking about drug policy, you wouldn't speak about human rights. I call that, in a metaphorical way, kind of Berlin Wall between Geneva and Vienna. In Vienna, you discuss drug policy in the CND, and in Geneva, you have all the treaty bodies, the human rights treaty bodies. And in Geneva, you wouldn't speak about drug policy, and in Vienna, you wouldn't speak about human rights. And that has gone for a lot of years. That's a very pessimistic view. The more optimistic view, and that's my third thesis, is that, as Bob Dylan would say, times they are changing. This world has been, in a sense, destroyed. Now you have more connections, not strong connections, but more connections between drug policy and human rights law. These connections are going in the two sides. On the first side, those who discuss and have responsibilities in relation to drug policies are accepting that they have to fulfill human rights. The most important document in that respect, I would say, was the UNGAS document 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that really said that clearly, that drug policy should be developed within the framework of human rights. So now it's accepted, at least in theory, that when you have to develop a drug policy, you have to make it in the framework of human rights, respecting human rights. That's the side in which drug policies has beginning to accept that human rights is relevant for drug policy. But the second one, and I would say is the more interesting, maybe not the most important, but the more interesting, is that human rights treaty bodies and human rights bodies have been more and more involved in drug policy in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. It's a very recent development, and I would make some examples. The first example was a report made by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights 2 or 3 years ago before the Human Rights Council about the negative impacts of drug policy in the enjoyment of human rights and the reforms that were necessary to be achieved in order to make in compliance with human rights with the different drug policies. That was a very important report. The second is that most treaty bodies, as you know, treaty bodies are the committees in the framework of the United Nations that has the responsibility to monitor the implementation of different human rights treaties. In my case, I made part of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that has the duty to monitor the implementation by states of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Those committees have been more and more involved in when they study the reports of states or when they make other statements to take into account drug policy as a factor that is very important in some violations of human rights. That has been the case of our committee, but that has been also the case of the Human Rights Committee in relation to death penalty, of the Committee Against Torture that says that in certain cases, for instance, the withdrawal of opioid substitution treatments is a kind of torture, etc. So many treaty bodies have been involved in dealing with issues of drug policy as a human rights issue, and that's very important. So that's my third point, that more and more there's a kind of breach between human rights law and drug policy. With that, I enter the fourth point that it would be the focus of my last minutes in this presentation, is that has a lot of potential. What I would defend is that with this kind of, if you want, of effort of trying to bring into drug policy human rights considerations and bring into the human rights world the issue of drug policy has a lot of potential to justify or to fight for more human drug policy. And let me put two examples that were discussed yesterday in some parts of the debates that we dealt in our committee. I can speak about that because these are official documents. And this has to do with the revision that the committee made of two of the countries that has more serious human rights violation associated with drug policy, and I would say that's Philippines and Russia. And we have to study the cases of Philippines and Russia, and in our concluding observation, are if you want, the statements of fact and the recommendation that the committees makes when they revise the situation of the state. And in the concluding observations in relation to Philippines in 2016, the committee expressed its condemnation of its concern about the declaration made by high-ranking officials in the context of the so-called war on drugs that was seen as encouraging and legitimizing violence against drug users, including extrajudicial killings. And the committee reiterates that there was evidence that extrajudicial killings have increased in all those years. And the committee also was concerned about the criminalization of the possession and use of drugs that blocks a person in need of treating from receiving such treatment, and the shortage of treatment centers that provide evidence-based health services such as opioid substitution therapies. And with this concern, then the committee made the recommendation for the state to stop any extrajudicial killings and to investigate these extrajudicial killings in order to bring into justice those responsible of that. And the committee recommends the state to reconsider the criminalization of possession and use of drugs and adopt a right to health approach to drug abuse and harm reduction strategies such as syringe exchange programs and increase the availability of treatment services that are evidence-based and respectful of the rights of drug users. So that's an example. We have other examples in the examination of the committee of other cases. I cannot speak about the case of Russia because of limits of time, but it's very similar. That means that things that were considered some years ago only as political discussions, very important political discussion, now they are also, besides being political discussion, they are also human rights issues that can be discussed before human rights treaty bodies. And that's my invitation, to bring to the world of human rights all this discussion about drug policy. Because if there had been a separation in the official spheres about drug policy discussion and human rights, I would say that in the world in the civil society world, there had been the same separation. Those who then deal with issues of drug policy usually don't use human rights mechanisms in order to convey the message that drug policies have to change. And all those who are involved in human rights organizations usually don't deal about the issues of drug policy. So we need to make that bridge because that bridge has a lot of potential. But with that, I enter with my last point, and that's the limits of these strategies. I recommend strongly to create this bridge and to use the human rights law for drug policy discussion, but we have to accept that that has limits. That drug policy, the need to reform drug policy is essentially a political discussion, a citizen discussion in which we have to be involved. But in that discussion, human rights law can play a very important but limited role, And in that sense, I think and that's the message of me as a Colombian, I think that one of the most important links that we have to make is to put in contact the different persons that suffered about this irrational drug policy, that is prohibition, that usually are not in contact. We are here in a harm reduction conference, and in that harm reduction conference, I'm sure that there are not many persons that come from South countries that are involved in the other side of negative and effects of prohibition, for instance, as a person who are involved in cultivation of illicit crops, like coca growers. And I think that as we have also separation between human rights law and drug policy, we have a separation about the discussion about harm reduction strategy in relation to people who use drugs, and the need to have a kind of harm reduction strategy in relation to other people affected by drug policy. In Colombia, the people who are most suffering now about the implication of drug policy are those people who are pushing for a reform of drug policy in relation, for instance, to illicit cultivation, in relation that we need more alternative development programs than aerial spraying or forced eradication. These are people that now are being killed in Colombia by people who want to defend again a kind of war on drugs, or want to defend the existence of these illicit drugs. So my last message is we have to create a kind of solidarity between all the different weak actors in relation, in the whole chain of drug policy. And let me finish with a personal example. Some 25 years ago, when I began to reflect on drug policy, I was already against prohibition, but only because of Colombia. I was in a country that was destroyed in part because of drug violence, and I said in a sense, I don't care about people who use drugs, but we need to change this policy, because if not, our countries are going to be destroyed. And I was invited to a conference in Paris, and I met there people who were concerned about the effects of drug prohibition in relation with people who use drugs. And they said to me, I don't care about if legalization is going to have bad influence on Latin American countries, because you are going to lose a lot of narco dollars. But we need to change this policy because of people who use drugs. And I said, we have a strong misunderstanding here. We are both in agreement that the effects on the most vulnerable persons of drug policy are on both sides. But we still have to make a bridge between these both sides, between the impacts on the south of drug policies and in the impact on drug policies on people who use drugs. Thank you.